welcome everyone to NiCHE Conversations. I'm Jessica DeWitt, one of the editors here at NiCHE, and today I am joined by Camille-Mary Sharp. Do you want to tell us more about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Hi, Jessica. Great to finally meet you face to face. My name is Camille-Mary Sharp. I am a postdoctoral associate at Western University in the Visual Arts departments and department in the Center for Sustainable Curating. And my research broadly looks at museums and resource extraction. And Ellie's here, yay!
Yay! And we also have Eleanor Armstrong with us today. Do you want to tell us about yourself?
One more time.
Okay.
Okay, that looks good.
Yeah, we can blame this on not my university, but a university in the UK's Wi-Fi that just keeps bumping me out every time I join the call.
Oh, no. Well, welcome. Fingers crossed. Do you want to tell us about yourself?
Yes, hi. I'm so sorry.
No
I'm Eleanor Armstrong.
worries.
I'm a space research fellow at the University of Leicester, where my research mostly looks at social studies of outer space with a queer feminist lens. But I'm also extremely interested in how we can take anti-colonial approaches to physical science museums, particularly thinking about both space exhibitions and also mineralogical collections, which is what has led me to this wonderful collaboration with Camille.
Yes. So do we want to start off by talking a bit more about how the both of you got interested in, well, I guess I should say, tell everyone that we're talking about your special issue in Museum and Society. All of this hubbub has thrown me off my game here. So you have a special issue.
Yes, we just published a special issue of Museum and Society called Mobilizing Museum Minerals.
Yes.
It's an open access issue, so everybody can read it. It is a huge issue. It's a double issue with 17 articles and an editorial introduction. And we have a launch event this coming Tuesday that we can say a little bit more about at the end, that anybody who's interested could join as well. I guess I can say just a very brief thing about how I got interested in this topic, and then maybe Ellie can share the story of how we then connected on this project.
Sure.
So like I mentioned earlier, I research museums and resource extraction, and that mostly has looked like investigating the relationship between Canadian museums and oil companies. So I've been really interested in museums and oil, and around 2020 I started to become interested in museums and mining companies as well. And just to kind of condense a very long story into a couple of sentences, investigating those relationships means looking at the history of the development of mineral collections in museums, because so many of them have come as donations from mining companies. So I kind of accidentally stumbled upon this wealth of information and history about museum minerals, and just started to become really interested in that topic.
Awesome.
Yeah. And I separately on like a parallel path to Camille became very interested in this when I took up a postdoc at the University of Delaware. During that position, a colleague Kopo Oromeng and I won funding from the University of Delaware to run a workshop that we called Unearthing the Collection, which was had the idea behind it that as there's a lot of literature in kind of history of science, environmental histories that tackles kind of the history of extractivism, but this is very poorly translated into the public domain. And the idea of this funding was for us to spend time with museum studies students at the university to think about how to translate some of this into activities or resources for using in museums. And as a result of this, Camille and I ended up at the same session for a class at Bryn Mawr that's led by Selby Hart, who's one of our contributors, and Carrie Robbins, who together were contributing 2 papers to our special issue. And slid into Camille's DMs on the Zoom being like, hey, we should do something, like maybe a special issue. And that's how we got into this in November 2022. It's been a real labor of love for us working with the authors and also with the journal. Both of us, I think, in that time have moved countries at least once.
Yes.
And So it's been like, really exciting to see this develop and also kind of work together as junior scholars, see each other grow as well. So it's been exciting to see that development as well, like alongside this academic scholarly baby that we've produced, but also to see ourselves grow as scholarly contributors in this way as well.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I remember us publishing the call for some submissions for this. So I was really excited when I saw it was actually out in the world and open access.
Yes.
Yes.
So you touched upon this, but of course, as an environmental historian, I'm very interested in the environmental aspects of this issue. So I wonder if you could just talk a bit more about how these mineral collections can be connected to like environmental histories, as well as you talk in your intro and others talk in the issue, to environmental museology, which is I'm not in museum studies, so it's actually kind of an introduction to this kind of topic for me. So if you could talk about the environment.
Sure, I can do a brief preface and then pass it to Ellie. I mean, just generally, your question about environmental history. The history of minerals is a history of the environment, right?
Yes.
It's a history of their extraction. It's a history of environmental science. It's a history of environmental degradation. And more broadly, minerals are also, the minerals on display in museums have the potential to kind of tell a history or multiple histories of the social, economic, political relations and cultural relations too, that have impacted and continue to impact our natural environment. And in terms of museum collections of minerals, I mean, at least from a Canadian perspective, because that's what I've been looking at, there is so much overlap between the development of mineral collections in Canadian museums and the history of, for example, I mean, organizations that environmental historians, which by the way, I am not one, that environmental historians are very familiar with, like the Geological Survey of Canada, or for Canadians, the Ontario Bureau of Mines has a lot of overlapping history with the development of Canadian mineral collections in museums, and also such an overlapping history with settler colonial geography itself, right?
Yeah.
And so to say just a little bit about environmental museology, it's still an emerging field, and it's still as most emerging fields are, it's still waiting to be defined in the literature. And I think we do a good job in the editorial introduction of kind of trying to give a condensed definition of what we think environmental museology is. But it's anything from kind of operational museum practice in terms of having more sustainable, energy efficient operations for museums, to content-based environmental museology. So for example, how have curators, collections workers in museums, educators, kind of, to use a word that we all love now, mobilize the information and collections that museums have into maybe inspiring social change and climate action. So there's been kind of a shift, or since the early 2000s, there's been a lot of initiatives to try to channel the influence that museum can have towards social change, and then in the last 10 years has been mostly about more about climate action in museums. So that's kind of what we view as environmental museology. There's so much more that we could say, but I'll leave it to Ellie.
Yeah, if you want more of these wonderful thoughts, just read the editorial, because that's where we go into it in quite a lot of detail.
Yeah.
But I also think something that I mean, we've touched on like the kind of more colonial history and the way that this is tied in really with like how museums themselves are often products of the colonial past as well. So I have written my PhD, and my research there was on the museums in London, which are obviously extremely colonial institutions. And we find in those collections like the assembly of rocks and minerals from around the world. But like in a way that means largely the British Empire at the time, rather than like the world in its entirety. But we see this as like also shaping the way that people can learn and have access to knowledge about the natural world through these colonial pathways. And my thinking in this regard was really inspired by some work that was happening at UCL at the time and at the Natural History Museum at the time by folks like Miranda Lowe and Subhadra Das, who wrote a really wonderful paper about this in kind of the early 2010s, which has been a real jumping off point for many of the contributors in our special issue. But I also think that something I was thinking about a lot with this question, Jessica, was like how our issue touches on other themes that I think are really important to environmental studies and environmental historians in particular. Questions about like chronology and chronopolitics, questions about what it means to think about the categories of things like waste and things like the product, like which kinds of labor, I think Camille touched on this briefly, which kind of labor is valued, how we come to learn and know about the environment as urban dwellers or as people who visit urban spaces where these museums often are. And I think we can see this like represented really interestingly across the papers in the collection as well, these different kinds of environmental questions that kind of come up in the papers that the scholars of our issue have written. In particular, like one paper that springs to mind is a paper by Danielle Kidsey, who thinks about how diamonds in the British Museum come to have emotional meanings and emotional registers that are particularly oriented towards like the feminine and the like amazement of these as shiny, fantastic objects, kind of as a counterpoint to other types of carbon like coal, which was seen as like a much more masculine pursuit, masculine interest. Yeah. So this idea of like really challenging how we come to know and think about the natural world as a product of colonial capitalism as well.
Wow. Yeah, this topic is just so rich, and it really illustrates how interconnected so many of our different fields that we sometimes try to pretend are different things. But we all are like, it's just a really illustrative example of this. And that's what I've delved into parts of the issue so far, and it's just really wonderful. We try to, section ourselves of environmental historians, museum specialists, blah, 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 blah. But we're all, connected and can enrich each other's work and knowledge and stuff. So,
and just to jump in on that, I think something that's been super interesting to me as we've been working on this is to see the number of people who are writing like environmental history pieces that use the collections in these museums, but then to not see any of that information that's kind of that new theorizing and that new thinking being brought back into the public domain to talk with members of the public and to share that kind of perspective. So it's something that I'm really excited about this issue is to kind of bring those objects and those scholarly artifacts like into conversation with the people who are doing the curating, but also bring those historians like into a new space, like you say.
Yeah, and I always like, at my work at NiCHE, I'm always on the lookout for people writing environmental history who don't realize it, or like like they don't think of themselves in any way as environmental historians. They're not even trained in it, but what they're doing is actually a form of environmental history. And I think there's obviously other, different subsections of history or what have you that do the same thing. But and
just to jump in. Several museum scholars have said this, as my supervisor reminded me not too long ago, that museum studies is inherently interdisciplinary. So come on in, Exactly. If you're interested in the museum and society issue, just, join us. We're not a cult, I promise.
Yes. Love it. So I wanted to finish off by just kind of like delving more into this use of the word mobilize. And what do you mean when you're using this verb? And can you give a few examples from the issue of like that illustrate this use of this word?
Sure. Okay, I love that word and I love this question. I also am very interested in my research and teaching and museum activism. So there's definitely, at least for me, kind of an activist undertone to this verb mobilizing. I interpret it as kind of gathering something or gathering a group of things or a group of people and activating them strategically for a specific outcome for specific means or particular outcomes. In the museum sector and in museum studies, I often hear, or like we often say, that the two most important resources of museums are, one, their publics, and two, their visitor communities. One, their publics, so their visitor communities, and two, their collections, or the knowledge that resides within those collections. I think Bob Janes wrote in 2023 that what makes museums unique is that they're like these three-dimensional cultural memory banks. And so I've come across this verb to mobilize about museums, specifically how they should mobilize those two resources that they have into, you know, social change or climate action or whatever that may be. But then when we're talking about mobilizing minerals in museums, I see it as not just mobilizing individual specimens, but also the stories that they hold, right? The relations that we previously talked about that they might communicate, but also thinking about their broader exhibitions and displays within which they're interpreted. And of course, the discipline of mineralogy itself, which yeah, I think that one maybe Ellie can speak to as being the trickiest one to mobilize in a way. But yeah, I mean, for me, mobilizing all these things is kind of activating them, reforming them, reframing them as well, critically questioning them, because they can be quite stagnant, mineral displays in museums, as we talk about in the issue.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we've really gone into, I think, in the editorial, and just to bring this back, is like it's not just the collections that are being mobilized, but I think we've really placed an emphasis on thinking about curators and others who are working in the museum. So that might be researchers or public-facing folks, but also to think about the resource that is the people who are working in the museum, not just the collections and their publics. And we talk about a previous special issue, actually, that was a Museum and Society, that was about museums as organizations, and how that organization focus is actually also a really crucial thing to be doing. So I think there's like another dimension to this mobilizing for us, which is to really think about bringing together scholars and practitioners. And you'll notice in the special issue that we have many people who are scholars, but we also have many curators who are writing from work that they're doing in the collection. So we're not just thinking about like the possibility and the potential of mobilizing these collections or thinking about how they can be mobilized, but actually like the practice that is happening in the institutions at the moment. We have a number of really cool projects that are kind of tracing individual specimens and talking about that in the papers that they've written. I'm thinking of papers from the Hunterium and the National Museum of Scotland and the Sedgwick Earth Sciences Museum, but also thinking about folks who are writing about how to transform the practices of the museum, for example, the archival practices and how we think about records that are alongside these minerals. And so, yeah, it's like not just the collections and not just the way that they can be shared with publics, but also the people who are doing this work that we're interested in mobilizing. To come back to that more activist root of the word that Camille is talking about, like to see this as a practice of around people as much as objects and things. And yeah, I also just love the idea in my mind. Every time we talk about it, I have this like visual of rocks on a little march to a new destination. And I know that's not what they're actually doing, but I always think about it as like, yeah, this practice of kind of moving these very inanimate. I think it has a nice contrast as well to the inanimacy of the minerals, to think about them as active participants, active non-animal, non-human participants in the knowledge that we're making about the environment and about the world that we live in.
Awesome. Wow. Well, as I said, I've been working my way through the special issue, and people can find it on our website or head to Museum and Society, but it's really wonderful. And you said you have a launch next week?
Yes. So if anybody would like to join us for an hour and a half a virtual launch event on Zoom to celebrate the issue and hear from some of our authors and have kind of a casual roundtable discussion. You can find all the details on the Instagram account of Center for Sustainable Curating. Everybody's welcome. It's at 11 a.m. Eastern Time and 4 p.m. UK time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so you just register, and we hope to see you there.
Yeah, and there'll be time for meeting other people who come to the session as well, in the spirit of mobilizing a community of people who are interested in this as well. So come along and meet other folks who are interested in making this a practice.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, well, thank you two for joining me. This was really fun, despite
thank you so much. Thank you so much for putting up with my technical infallibility, I guess.
Thank you.
Well,
thank you so much, Jessica, for inviting us. This was super cool.
This has been really fun.
Yeah.
And I'm no longer so terrified about an Instagram Live.
Yeah,
even though I
so
messed up very
right?
badly.
It feels very intimate, despite it not being.
Exactly. Thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.